going to call to order a public hearing for the Planning and Economic Development Committee on Tuesday, March 7th, 2017 at 7:04 p.m. in the Aldermanic Chamber. And if the clerk would call the roll, please.
Alderwoman Marianne Mutsugoya.
Present.
Alderman Dan Moriarty, I'm here. Alderman at Large Brian McCarthy.
Present.
Alderman Tom Lopez.
I'm here.
Alderman Ben Clemens.
Here.
And it appears we also have in attendance Alderman Rick Dowd and Attorney Steve Bolton.
Okay, thank you. So we have two pieces of legislation as part of this public hearing. The first one is 016020, clarifying and updating the elderly housing supplemental use regulations and related provisions. And before I ask for testimony, Attorney Bolton, would you mind updating us? And I know you attended the planning board meeting. Thank you.
Yes, the planning board is recommending in favor of this. I think it's now a few weeks ago that it was before them. You've seen earlier versions of this proposed legislation, and there's been much discussion. In its present form, as previously amended in this committee, one significant change is throughout, instead of using the term elderly housing, it uses the term housing for older persons. It eliminates the list of 6 or 7 types of facilities that were, depending on how you read it, either the only types of facilities that could be built under the what is currently the ordinance, or was a listing of examples of types that could be. And now it basically says that any type of project that complies with the provisions of the Human Rights Act and their requirements for housing for older persons meets the requirements of this ordinance, as long as it provides the facilities and services that are listed here. It eliminates the reference to the Human Rights Act regulations, which have expired and are now out of date, but incorporates some of the language that were in there. It lists specific types of the facilities and services that are necessary to qualify. These are right out of what were formerly the Human Rights Commission regulations. It changes the provisions regarding to the number of units that are required. It's 30 units in the case of new development. That's the same. Previously, under the current ordinance, it is 10 units in the case of redevelopment of sites. The current version before you proposes to add the words containing or most recently containing non-residential uses. There are other changes as well. It makes clear that more than one building can be built. It does not have to have a situation where you're putting all the units in one building. And it adds and makes some changes to the density table and the zoning districts in which this will apply. So I think those are the salient changes in the ordinance as it has now been amended and is again before you this evening.
Okay, thank you. With that summary, I'll ask for testimony in favor, and if you wish to make testimony either in favor or in opposition, if you would just come and you can take either of the seats at the end of the horseshoe and state your name and address for the record. So once again, testimony in favor? Testimony, oh, okay. In favor. Okay.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, members of the committee, Attorney Bolton. My name is Brad Westgate. I'm a lawyer with Weiner Bennett in Nashua, 111 Concord Street. I also reside at 17 Preserve Drive. I represent Crimson Properties LLC, and its principal, Randy Trammell, is here with me tonight. We've been here before you on a number of occasions, Madam Chairman, when you've discussed this proposed legislation. From the beginning, we've had the opportunity to interact with Attorney Bolton's office on the revisions to this draft legislation. We're happy that his office has been receptive to some of the thoughts and comments and revisions that we've proposed. We do speak in favor of the proposed elderly housing ordinance changes, Madam Chairman, but we do have one reservation, which has to do with the provision that Attorney Bolton was describing regarding renovation of, rehabilitation of existing properties. Under the current ordinance, the nature of the existing property, if it's going to be renovated, is immaterial. The rule is that if you're going to renovate an existing property, you have to have more than 10 units of now housing for older persons or elderly housing to qualify under the ordinance. This change that's part of the proposed legislation would eliminate the residential opportunity for renovation. In other words, it would have to be a non-residential site to meet the more than 10 unit threshold. Now, if the legislation passes with that particular provision, then the threshold would mean 30 in a residential rehabilitation, not 10 as is currently the case. And I think I've mentioned before in front of the committee that there didn't seem to be any real logic in having to extract out the residential opportunities for rehabilitation, especially because the primary zoning districts for which the housing for older persons is designated are residential district. I know that there's been some discussion about the idea that there may be cases of underutilized industrial or commercial properties in any particular district that could meet that lower threshold when redeveloped. But again, I'm not so certain there's been any real testimony or information provided to the board that sort of justifies that new distinction. Madam Chairman, relative to I don't want to jump ahead of myself, regarding the setback ordinance, which is coming next, you're going to ask specific testimony on that?
Yes.
Okay, so I won't discuss that at this point. So we would respectfully submit that the ordinance as proposed be adopted, or that this committee recommend its adoption, but eliminate the change contemplated in section 19042B3, which deals with the rehabilitation or redevelopment provision that I've mentioned. And would respectfully submit that the committee take under consideration during your meeting these thoughts. Thank you.
Any other testimony in favor? Testimony in opposition?
Good morning, or excuse me, good evening, members of the committee. I want to thank you for all the time and effort you've put into this program for the last six or so months. I know it's been quite an ordeal to go through this literally line by line. I was kind of betwixt and between if I was in support of the project or against it in terms of this ordinance, but it comes down to that I'm against it, but I'm only against it for section B3.
Okay, and could I just have you state your name
Oh,
and
I'm
address
sorry.
for the record, please?
I'm sorry.
That's
My
fine.
name is Thomas or Tom Preto, 41 Raymond Street in Nashua, New Hampshire. And my son has a project on 122 Main Street, on Manchester Street. And, you know, it's my opinion that this ordinance was proposed by Mayor Donchis in a reaction to that proposed project on 122 Manchester Street. And when I looked at this, and I already gave testimony to the board or to this committee, that restricting senior housing is against the master plan. The master plan is clear that the city of Nashua is going to encourage dramatic growth in its senior citizens, and it also is clear that it requires the development of infill locations. What I believe this section B3 does, by mandating that it has to be more than 30 units, particularly in the RA zone. The RA zone is usually the most ideal zones for senior housing or housing for elderly people, because that has the closest proximity to services, particularly for the elderly. They have stores, they have shopping, they have doctors, they have the hospital, and most of those are in your RB and RA zone. Requiring that you can only develop sites that, let me go back to the 30 units. In the RB zone, if you're requiring a minimum of 30, there's been no testimony, and in fact, there has been, based on my assertion of review of the tax maps, there's not enough land in any RA or any RB zone to accommodate 30 units. So anyone that's proposing this knows that for a fact, that while they're proposing it, they can't build it because the land doesn't exist to build it. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to propose this section B3 and state that it only applies to project containing more than 30 units when you know, according to B1, that it's suitable for the RA and RB zone. So I think you have to look very closely at the intent of this, and that is to restrict senior housing in the RA zone and certainly the RB zone. And the thought that going on that if you have more than 10 units of redevelopment, it has to contain a non-residential use. Can any of you, I used to be a utility mailman when I was going to college, and I walked every vacation route of every mailman in the city. And I can't think of very many non-residential uses in the city of Nashua that you would want to redevelop into senior housing. They're usually in most instances now, in commercial industrial zones. And I think it's inappropriate to place senior housing in a non-residential area. The bottom line is this. Under this section B3, it will decrease both the availability and the desirability of senior housing in the city of Nashua, period. In addition to which, I know that I've asked 2 or 3 times and I've gotten the bottom line answer that as far as the ordinance indicating, the proposed ordinance indicating that there's no fiscal impact, you know, there certainly seems to be a fiscal impact to me in my business world when you have revenue in the context of 122 Manchester Street of around $6,900. And if it was fully built out, which couldn't happen under this ordinance under B3, the revenue would go up, you know, 5, 6 times. And I think, you know, the city's response to me has been consistent that the fiscal impact only looks at immediate expenditures and not long-term implications of the loss of revenue. I think that is inconsistent with most people's understanding of fiscal impact. Now, I am not an expert. I see, you folks on TV 3 or 4 nights a week. So I know that, you folks know a lot more about fiscal impacts than I do. But I can tell you this, is that a few people I've spoken to that have been affiliated with city government have told me that fiscal impact usually looks at the long-range opportunities of loss income in addition to which immediate expenditures. So that information may be incorrect. You folks know the vernacular term of fiscal impact, and maybe there's none, but the reality is loss of potential revenue because you can't develop a site, because this ordinance precludes development in the RA and RB zone particular for more than 10 units because they have to be in a non-residential use, is definitely, in layman's term, as a business person, has a fiscal impact. We don't have to discuss, because I hear it on Channel 16 often, how the city is scraping for every dollar that it can to support our schools in particular. So for these reasons that I just gave, I urge the board to support this ordinance, except to eliminate this section B3. And I think that if you eliminate this section B3, you still have a great ordinance, you still supply senior housing, you still give seniors a choice, and you're still consistent with the master plan. I appreciate, again, your time and energy and effort in this endeavor. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to make testimony in opposition? Testimony in favor? Seeing none, testimony in opposition? I'm sorry? This is still for, 16, yes. Okay, seeing no testimony in opposition, we will close the public hearing regarding 016020. And we will now move on to the public hearing regarding 017029 regarding side and rear setbacks for a lot with multiple principal buildings. And once again, Attorney Bolton, if you could do a summary for us.
Thank you. At one time, some of what's covered in this piece of legislation was covered in earlier versions of the one we've just been going through, but it was recognized that the issue to be addressed here applies in other than elderly housing or housing for older persons. It really applies anytime you have more than one principal structure on a lot, and chiefly where you have private roadways or driveways, and so you have a building that is facing the access to the buildings on that lot, but as oriented to the public street. You may be, what you're thinking is the back of the building as oriented to the public street. That's really the side of the lot. And so that was realized that our requirements for setbacks, for side yard setbacks, rear yard setbacks, may not make perfect sense as applied to those situations. So this is chiefly Alderman McCarthy's solution to that, which is to say, as to the sides and rear of a lot with more than one principal structure on it, that the setbacks along the side and along the rear would mirror the setbacks of the property which they abut at any point. So you would go around and see what the setback requirement would be on the abutting lot, and you apply that to the lot you're dealing with. And that's what I've tried to capture. The new language essentially is on the second page in subsection B. And so that was my original attempt. Now, I know Attorney Westgate has got a rework of his own that seeks to modify that same language, and I have no problem with the way he's saying it. So when that comes along, you can just know that Attorney Westgate's language is perfectly fine with me if that's what the board chooses to go with. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Attorney Bolton. After hearing the summary, I will take testimony in favor of 017029. Seeing none, testimony in opposition.
Thank you again, Madam Chairman and members of the committee. Attorney Bolton, my name is Brad Westgate, lawyer with Weiner Bennett Nashville, 111 Concord Street, reside at 17 Preserve Drive, representing Crimson Properties LLC. Appreciate Attorney Bolton's summary of the history of this ordinance. The concept was initially part of the elderly housing ordinance, but then extracted from that and became this standalone proposed legislation. I've mentioned to the committee before, I've mentioned to the planning board as well, that I'm opposed to the adoption of this ordinance, even though I have prepared some alternative language to it. I prepared the alternative language, which I'll hand out again when I'm done, just because I think it does, if something is going to get adopted, I respectfully would submit that the proposed language I've written makes it a bit clearer that you're dealing with the setback as required, not setbacks that may be actual, and you're talking about specific properties adjacent to each other in a very, and I think in a clearer way. But the reasons we, and I oppose the proposed ordinance are several. First of all, it would apply citywide. It applies to every property in the city of any nature, including city-owned property, by the way. As presently written, it's unclear to me whether it applies to existing properties, meaning existing developed properties, because it does talk in terms of buildings to be located. But how that would be interpreted, whether there's a grandfathering status for existing structures, what happens to existing structures, say in a multi-building retail plaza that were built with the side yard setbacks in line, but now are adjacent to a property that has rear yard setbacks to its side yard. Can those properties be expanded? Would a variance be necessary to add on to a building in a retail plaza, for example, that's adjacent to the side yard setback, even without breaching the side yard setback, but adding on to that building? How does all that play itself out? And again, I don't see a groundswell of reasoning to apply this kind of provision on a citywide basis when there could be, I think, a fair number of unintended consequences. And again, an ordinance like this simply becomes an additional hurdle for someone with either property to be redeveloped or newly developed or simply added on to walk through when under the present ordinance, none of that would be necessary. I've by no means thought of all the implications of this proposed legislation, but besides recognizing it applies across the board citywide to any type of property, and again, there are many types of multi-structure properties on a single lot, not just residential condominiums that have detached structures, but apartment complexes, commercial retail plazas, industrial buildings with industrial facilities with several buildings on it. All of them get wrapped up into this ordinance. I think the committee understands the way the ordinance would work, and that is, I think as Attorney Bolton noted, if you have a single lot, say, and it has a private drive or access road in it, and it's got buildings to the side of that access road, the side yards that you would think of in the normal scenario are side yards, and you meet those setbacks. But if adjacent to that lot there's a public road and there are several lots off that public road, its rear yard comes against the one lot side yard, and the one lot side yard now has to meet the rear yard setback adjacent to it only for those components of the one lot property that are adjacent to rear yards. So you may have a one lot property that's significantly sized, and it for a while has a side yard setback, then bumps out to a rear yard setback, bumps back to a side yard setback. I think you'll see that case more in the commercial setting, frankly, than the residential setting. But, so you're going to create a situation where you don't have uniformity in the setback line, for example. A couple other thoughts. The city, there's legislation that was passed last year at the state level to the effect that city zoning ordinances and town zoning ordinances have to accommodate accessory dwelling units. And the committee is probably aware of that. And I suspect there's work being done at City Hall to figure out how the land use code will be modified if necessary to accommodate accessory dwelling units in any case where there's, say, a single-family dwelling permitted. Those accessory dwelling units could be either detached or attached, depending upon how the land use code ultimately gets amended. That's the kind of residential scenario where this provision may have some significant impact. How will it affect your ability to implement changes to the land use code to deal with accessory dwelling units, which you'll have to do? It's that type of thing that is hard to predict on how this ordinance impacts it, but it will make things a little more difficult. So I would just simply submit that given what all the unintended consequences could be, and without a groundswell need for this on a citywide basis, that this legislation not be adopted. Two things to hand out. Again, you've seen this before, but I'll just hand out, this is my alternative language. Again, I'm not promoting the language, I'm just submitting it as a sort of academic drafting exercise, you might say. Also, I know the committee received from Mr. Trammell today, I think through his email, a copy of the letter from Sam Tamposi Jr., who was in opposition of this setback requirement as well. I have the original of that letter just to submit for your records, Madam Chairman, but I believe you all have it already. Mr. Tamposi had asked Mr. Trammell if he'd be kind enough to get it submitted to the committee.
Thank you. Yes, that was received and left on all committee members' desks this evening, so they have it. But thank you for the original and the copy. I'll give you that to put with the minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay. Is there any other testimony in opposition? And again, if you would state your name and address for the record, please. Thank you.
My name is Thomas Perito, 41 Raymond Street, and I understand this committee is planning and economic development, and my comments are more aimed towards the economic development provision of your charter or goal for this committee. I'm in the real estate business and I travel quite a bit, and what I've noticed is that in New England particularly, for example, all communities are seeking economic development, and part of that economic development is to include flexibility in their land use codes. That's an overwhelming trend throughout the Northeast. And what you'll see is, particularly in New Hampshire and particularly in Nashua, 67 or 68% of your city revenue comes from property taxes. And the property tax investments come from, discretionary property tax investments come from investors or users that decide to settle into the city. And I will tell you, and you only have to look at the earthquake that happened in Connecticut when General Electric moved out of Connecticut into Boston because of land use issues. It's a particular problem with most cities and towns because they recognize that if they don't have a vibrant real estate simplicity of understanding the implications of their investments in the community, they usually go to another community. And I think this ordinance, no matter how many times you read it, backwards, forwards, upside down, there are a lot of unknowns to it. And I know that talking to a few members of the real estate community in New England, when they don't understand it. And not to say that they're geniuses, but this is their profession, is to understand these codes. And when I say this is the new code proposed in Nashua, that if you own a property in Nashua, and if you want to do any additions or subtractions to a building, you may have some implications that trigger this and cause it to go into a ZBA, Zoning Board of Adjustment proceedings, which in many instances only results in a decision if there's no abutter opposition, in my experience. If there's abutter opposition usually in these public hearings, then the ZBAs tend to vote against an application. But at the end of the day, I think what this will do is to trigger nonconforming status in many properties, if not all properties that have multiple structures on a lot in the city of Nashua, without the board or this committee fully understanding the implications of what this ordinance means. I can't hold a candle to Attorney Bolton or Attorney Westgate and the legalese of the document, but just briefly reading it a number of times, there doesn't seem to be a nexus in terms of a foundation of where the setbacks start from. For example, there's no reference to a public street in the ordinance. If you look at what's proposed, you know, you'll have to look at a different section or a few different sections to understand, because nothing in that proposed ordinance says that the setbacks are triggered by the nexus of where the public street is located on the lot. And I think that's something that should be addressed unless it's addressed somewhere else in the ordinance. But I guess at the end of this, my comments are you to focus on your economic development hat and recognize that you're not in competition with other cities and towns necessarily in New Hampshire. You're in competition with 250 cities and towns in New England. And people that are making investments, trust me, they look at your ordinances and they look at them very carefully. And at the end of the day, if they can't understand them or they don't know the implications of what they mean, they'll just as soon move on to another city where the processes are either clearer or they're simpler to implement, because there's an unlimited amount of real estate in New England in terms of communities looking for outside investments. So I ask you to turn down this proposed ordinance for those reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. I will ask once again for testimony in favor of 017029. Seeing none. Testimony in opposition? None. And I will declare the public hearing closed at 7:30 p.m. Oh, I'm sorry, 7:37. And I will call to order a meeting of the Planning and Economic Development Committee on Tuesday, March 7, 2017 at 7:37 p.m. in the Aldermanic Chamber. And if the clerk would call the roll, please.
Alderwoman Mary Ann Multigoya.
Present.
Alderman at Large Dan Moriarty is here. Alderman at Large Brian McCarthy. Present. Alderman Tom Lopez. Here. And Alderman Ben Clemens. Here. Also in attendance, we have Alderman Rick Dowd and City Attorney Steve Bolton.
Okay, thank you. We have a quorum. I will ask for public comment. Okay, seeing none. Communication, I would like a motion that the rules be suspended to allow for the communication that was received after the agenda was prepared.
So moved.
Alderman Clemens. Okay, and this is the communication from Samuel A. Tamposi Jr. regarding proposed ordinance 017-029. And as you heard earlier, it was in opposition to that ordinance. And I need a motion to accept and place on
We
file.
need to vote on the first motion.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Yes.
Do we include the proposed changes by Attorney Westgate as well?
We can include that, yes, thank you. Yes, all those in favor of suspending the rules?
Aye.
Okay. And we actually have the two communications, the one I referenced by Mr. Tamposi and also from Attorney Westgate, alternative text for the provisions of 017-029. And a motion to accept and place on file, Alderman Clemmons.
I would move to accept and place on file both communications.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And that motion is carried. Unfinished business, we have none. New business, we have none. Do I have a motion to take from the table? Alderman Clemmons.
I move to take from the table ordinance 1620.
Okay, you've all heard the motion to take 016-020 from the table. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, we will take that. So, do I have a motion? Alderman Dowd.
It's not referenced on here that you had a feedback from, I guess you do, from, was that planning board? You do have, never mind.
I'm sorry?
I was just looking for the planning board recommendation to be highlighted.
Alderman Attorney Bolton spoke to that?
It's also noted on your agenda,
Right.
Madam Chair.
Favorable.
Yes,
Right,
it's
yeah.
on the agenda, yes. Okay, so do I have a motion for purpose of discussion? Alderman Clemmons?
I would move to indefinitely postpone, recommend indefinite postponement of 016-020.
Okay, you've heard the recommendation. Discussion? Alderman Moriarty.
And prior to that, section B3 seems to be redundant with table 42-2. So table 42-2 already itemizes the number of units per lot, just in the form of units per acre based on the zoning. So that section B3 seems to be redundant with it. So I'm going to make a motion to amend 01620 to strike that paragraph B3.
Okay. Alderman Clemmons, Alderman Lopez.
My question would be through you, Madam Chair, to either the maker of the motion or Attorney Bolton. Would striking that section B3 only eliminate that in that section, but would the language still be carried over because it's further down in the document?
Attorney Bolton.
Well, they're not redundant. They're talking about two different things.
Okay.
The table deals with the number of units per acre that you can have. So depending on which zone you're in, if you have 10 acres, you might have 120 units. Section B3 deals with the minimum number of units you can have for a project. So how small your lot can be, but they operate, I guess both things have to be satisfied, but
Okay.
one is not a substitute for the other.
Right, one's the minimum, one's the maximum, so I withdraw my motion.
Okay.
Sort of, yes. Enough said.
Alderman Lopez.
Just confused by the motions. Alderman Clemmons was motioning to table, but then we were striking language from what we were tabling? Indefinitely postpone.
Recommend indefinite postponement.
So do we amend it and then make the recommendation, or should we resolve whether we're recommending that and then discuss if we plan to not I mean, why amend it and then postpone it?
Because we may decide
Yeah.
to look at that and then to vote down his motion and make another recommendation. Alderman,
I'm not convinced that Mason's allows for a motion to amend on top of a motion to indefinitely postpone, I believe.
Motion to recommend indefinite postponement.
Hmm?
It's, how's any different from, excuse me, I see a motion to recommend indefinite postponement, the same as a motion to recommend final passage.
Except that a motion to recommend final passage opens the floor to amendments and debate of the bill that's in front of you. The debate on the motion for indefinite postponement should only be on the merits of indefinite postponement. I think we need to clear that motion first.
Yeah, let's check, because I don't see the motion to recommend
No.
indefinite postponement as a procedural, like a motion to table.
I mean, we're also not in the board, so we aren't indefinitely postponing it, but frankly, I think it is confusing. I guess were I in a mood to make that motion to modify paragraph B3, I would ask the maker of the motion for indefinite postponement to withdraw it.
Alderman Clemmons,
I withdraw my motion to recommend indefinite postponement.
do we have another motion? Alderman Lopez? No.
I was just going to make a motion to recommend final passage.
Alderman McCarthy and Alderman Clemmons.
Yeah, I would actually move to amend paragraph B3 back to its original wording.
Okay, you've heard the motion. Discussion? Alderman Clemmons?
To the maker of the motion through you, when you say original wording, do you mean, because we've had lots of different revisions of this, so I just want to make sure we understand how it should read.
Subject to correction by Attorney Bolton, I believe that the original wording was, and more than 10 units in the case of redevelopment of sites which have not received a site or subdivision plan approval in the previous 5 years, which would simply strike the underlined language in the draft that's in front of us.
So for folks who don't have the draft, it would be striking containing or most recently containing non-residential uses.
Yes.
And that would put it back to the original. Alderman McCarthy?
I mean, this was sort of, I mean, that's a paragraph that came from an ordinance I introduced about 10 years ago. But I'm sensitive to the fact that, taken in account with B1 and the current build-out state of the city, it actually does preclude using this in in most of the residential zone, which is where we believe this should be. So I'm willing to put that back into the original language. I don't think we've seen any ill effect of having it in there for 10 years, so having it in there for a few more won't hurt us.
Okay, so you've heard the motion to amend to go back to the original language for B3, which would then strike containing or most recently containing non-residential uses. Any additional comments, Alderman Lopez?
Yeah, I just want to clarify, by removing the language, so as it is now, for example, the bakery across the street or the factory at Spruce Street or, sites like that, those are the only ones that would be eligible for renovation. But by removing that language, does this mean that places like 243 Main Street or 23 Temple or places that are more than 30 units but are currently residential would also be eligible?
I don't think it has any change on sites that would be more than 30 units. It has an effect on properties in the residential zone, properties that are currently residential but that could sustain 10 to 30 units would be now included, whereas they're excluded if the language is left as in the draft.
Okay, What if they already do contain that many units? They're included?
If they already contain that many units, then, not to be facetious, but what are they doing here? I mean,
Just renovating it,
they're
making
already
it elderly
permitted.
housing when it was something else?
Hmm?
Maybe
It-
they would be renovating it into elderly housing, or?
It depends on the number of units of elderly housing that would be produced. It doesn't, if it's for example, if it's right now a 40-unit boarding house and it is anticipated to be changed into a 25-unit elderly housing, it would not be allowed under the under the language that's in the current draft. It would be allowed with the amendment.
Alderman Dowd?
So just for clarification for myself and the public, B3 would be the original language before any of the modifications to this ordinance were being introduced.
B3 would be, right, the original language, and the language that was introduced in relationship to B3, that if we revert to the original language, this language will be removed, containing or most recently containing non-residential uses. So
So-
B3 would go back to the original B3 that would be minus that language.
So I'm not a member of the committee, but I would be in support of that motion.
Thank you. Alderman Clemmons?
I too would support that. You know, listening to the public this evening and working with some of them over the last few months, I think that's kind of been the sticking point. It's certainly the sticking point for me. You know, I think that we need to do more to encourage not only housing for older people or older persons, but also, you know, we need to look into seeing if we can allow these types of developments for all people of all ages. So, you know, while I certainly agree that the motion on the floor is a good thing, I'd like to see us look to actually piggyback on that and see if we can, you know, provide housing for everyone in those types of residential zones. And I think, you know, if we were to have rejected it for elderly housing, then we would have done it probably for all housing. And I think that's the wrong direction to go. So I think leaving the original language in there is the right thing to do. And then hopefully what we can do in the future is expand it. So I'm in favor of this motion, and it will lead me to support the legislation.
Thank you. Alderman Lopez?
Parliamentary inquiry.
Yes.
I'll answer my own parliamentary inquiry. Section 430, I looked up the motion to postpone indefinitely. Section 431, precedence of motion to postpone indefinitely. The motion to postpone indefinitely takes precedence over nothing except the main motion to which it is applied and yields to all privileged, incidental, and other subsidiary motions, which to me, I interpret that as to imply that it allows normal debate and subsequent motions. Section 433, which is further down, says motion to postpone indefinitely opens main question to debate. And the motion to postpone is debatable. So I interpret the motion to indefinitely postpone as entirely analogous to the motion to for final passage, as well as the motion to recommend indefinite postponement. So my motion very much was in order. That doesn't explain, that doesn't answer Alderman Lopez's question is why would you amend something? And the reason I would amend it is because some people may choose to vote against the motion to indefinitely postpone, or once it gets to the full board, they may like the amended version better, and it may change their minds. So I thought it was worth, I was going to actually vote, I was going to vote yes on mine and yes on Alderman Clemmons's, as odd as that may sound.
Thank you. Alderman Lopez?
I'm concerned about the example that Alderman McCarthy gave, because I think the original intent of this ordinance was to, in my mind, encourage the development of elderly housing, which we really need Nashua in areas that are not currently being used for housing, such as some of the sites that I mentioned before. But if restoring it to its original language means you can take 40 units of existing housing and replace them with a smaller amount of only elderly housing, then I don't know that that actually improves the situation at all. It just replaces the population with a smaller number.
Comment, Alderman McCarthy.
I would consider that very unlikely to occur. It is hard to envision a case where the cash flow from a 40-unit development is not greater than that of a 25-unit development, and therefore there would have to be a very odd set of circumstances to have the developer come back and do that. I mean, bear in mind, they're free to do whatever they want to do with their property. If they want to develop it into something other than what it is, this just opens the options for which they can develop it. I don't think it encourages the deletion of existing housing. It encourages the development of housing that is a higher and better use.
Alderman Lopez.
If you had a 40-person rooming house that was targeting low-income personnel, and if it were renovated into elderly housing, which was higher end, wouldn't, even with a reduction of units, you potentially be able to generate more revenue?
Potentially. And that would be a case where the developer ought to be able to do that.
But this would incentivize it.
I mean, basically, we're sort of anti-legislating housing if we go the other way and say, well, you have to keep it in a lower use. You're not allowed to improve it to where it's more usable as residential property.
Alderman Lopez.
I think ultimately I'm in favor of the legislation, but not necessarily the amendment recently proposed.
Any other?
I would
Alderman McCarthy.
I would just point out that the amendment is exactly the way it's been for the last 10 years. We have not seen any effect where someone took a 40-unit residential property out of circulation and made it a 25-unit elderly housing project.
Any other? Alderman Clemens.
And, I would agree with Alderman McCarthy, and I would actually say that, you know, that something that is of my concern is that we've actually seen more elderly housing units being built than you know, standard market rate available to anyone type housing, and you know, even though I could easily vote for this in its present form, and we would do away with that problem that I see in my mind as, you know, an oversaturation of elderly housing. However, I don't feel that that's fair to the developers. I don't feel that that's fair to property owners. I don't feel that's fair to people who are looking for elderly housing. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to support the amendment, and then I'm going to advocate that we do something different in our zoning laws to make it easier for development of other types of housing in these similar circumstances.
Any other discussion? Alderman Dowd.
Just for clarification, they changed the wording from elderly housing to older persons.
Older
Just-
persons, yes. Thank you. Okay, so you've all heard Alderman McCarthy's amendment, which is to recommend returning to the original language for section B3, which would remove containing or most recently containing non-residential units, or uses, I'm sorry. All those in favor of the amendment?
Aye.
Opposed?
Hey,
And that motion carries. So we now have Alderman Lopez's recommendation to, or motion to recommend final passage, and that would be as amended.
mine was just a regular one, but I guess
Okay.
it's amended now because the amendment
Question.
passed.
Would you like to withdraw that? Someone else make a motion?
The result's going to be the same.
Okay. So The recommendation is for final passage of 016-020 as amended. Discussion? Alderman Moriarty?
We've done a lot, and we've eliminated a lot and put things back. Is anybody interested in summarizing in as few words as possible the essence of what we actually have changed?
I would ask Attorney Bolton.
Because this already exists, so we're not creating a whole new thing. We just made a couple
Yeah.
subtle
And-
things.
And Attorney Bolton, unfortunately, we have black and white copies.
So if I make reference to the red,
I
you're
was
not going
going,
to
I
know?
was just going to, yes, exactly, so.
Okay, well, trying to be as simple as possible. If you look to the third page, where you see the whole page has got struck-through language, and some onto the fourth page, that was a list of certain types of housing for older persons. Nursing homes, independent living, congregate housing, those sorts of things. Previously, it was unclear, and when I say previously, I mean what's in the existing land use code today. It was unclear whether that was an exclusive list of the things that could be built and get the density bonus of this section, or whether those were examples, non-exclusive examples of things that could be built. So you've clarified that. Furthermore, there was reference to rules of the New Hampshire Human Rights Commission that set forth what types of services and facilities that commission required in order to qualify something as elderly housing, so that it would not subject the owners and operators to charges of age discrimination. Those regulations have expired. You can, maybe you can find them still. We have them. But they are technically no longer law. So it makes little sense for us in the law we're passing to refer to something and say you have to be in compliance with these other laws, which are no longer laws. So what we've done is extracted from that what we thought was worthwhile, chiefly the list of services and facilities, which we make clear is a non-exclusive list, and say if you do roughly half of these or other things that seem to be in keeping with them, you qualify. So it makes this more easily administered, eliminates the archaic reference, and makes clear that you don't have to be one of the 6 or 7 enumerated categories in order to qualify. So it's an improvement over the confusion generated currently.
Thank you.
So is it fair to characterize this as it essentially is no more restrictive or less restrictive than the current resolution, current ordinances? It's just
Depending
easier-
on whether you regarded the list as exclusive or non-exclusive,
okay,
it's
okay.
either more expansive or it's as expansive.
Okay, gotcha.
Yes. Any other questions, comments? The motion is for final passage as amended. Alderman McCarthy?
I just wanted to offer one clarification. There was a discussion during the hearing about the fiscal note. And I wanted to clarify again that the reason for the fiscal notes on legislation that is submitted is that the charter requires that anything that it proposes an expenditure must enumerate the account from which the expenditure will come. The reason for the fiscal note is simply to determine if passing the ordinance binds the city to expend any money, which would then require that a fund to be enumerated as the source of that, not to do a long-term economic analysis of the policy effect of the ordinance. And I think we all agree that the policy effects on the economy are things that we that we debate, but those are not what is required by ordinance.
Thank you for that clarification. Any other comments? So the motion again is for final passage of 016-020 as amended. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And that motion carries. Okay. Do I have a motion to take from the table 017-029?
So moved.
Alderman McCarthy? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That motion carries. And do I have a motion?
Just for purpose of debate, I'll make a motion for final passage.
Okay, Alderman McCarthy. Final passage.
Of what?
This is 017-029, we're on to.
I'd like to,
Did we take it from the table?
Yes, we did,
I was
Alderman
spacing out,
McCarthy, and he's now recommending final passage. And I would just note that it is indicated that the planning board had a favorable recommendation on February 2nd. Yes, Alderman McCarthy.
yeah, I mean, I'd propose this because I think it technically resolves the issue that came up in some discussions, which is the disparate setbacks on some of these properties. I agree with the comment that it may have unintended consequences. Many of the things we do in land use often have those. I would point out that the number of places it will make non-conforming is, in my opinion, quite small. It's limited to places that have multiple principal structures, which we do not allow by ordinance. Even on the lots that were mentioned that are commercial centers. The Pheasant Lane Mall does not have multiple structures as far as I know. The Home Depot Plaza does not have multiple structures. Now, interestingly, the way that is avoided is to create some of the oddest shaped lots that have ever been seen. The frontage for Home Depot is actually over next to Barmakian Jewelers on a lot that goes around behind the rest of the plaza and comes up the edge of the right-of-way in between the mall and the back of the building where Michael's is. So we might be better off to allow multiple structures in more places because I think it would be less confusing, but we don't. And as a result, there are very few places that would be affected. None of them would be rendered non-conforming because of the way zoning is interpreted, which is if you had it the day the zoning ordinance passed, you are not necessarily non-conformant because you don't meet that. Or you are grandfathered and allowed to be non-conformant. If you came back to put additional structures on the lot, that might be an issue. However, most places do not have multiple structures to begin with and would not be affected by that provision. So I'm not sure about that, but the whole purpose of this is to balance the rights of the developer who's developing a new piece of property with the surrounding rights of well-established neighborhoods, which comes to be an issue that comes in front of us periodically, less frequently than it used to. But one of the things we might want to consider doing, and I think we do want to consider Attorney Westgate's amendment to this section because I think it makes clear what setback we're talking about, that it's the theoretical one and not the actual one, which is likely to be smaller or larger. One discussion we had when this was in the original 01620 draft was to allow the planning board the discretion to increase that requirement if it made sense with regard to the abutters. That may make sense with this legislation as well. I don't think the situation comes up very much. I think there are a lot of cases where it comes up and it's not important to keep the setback that way because of just the way the property is laid out, but it may be something that the planning board should be allowed to increase the setback requirements if they feel that the impact on the abutter would be harsh otherwise. So I think we can work out an amendment to do that if the committee is of a mind to do it. First, I will move to amend by including the language that was included in Attorney Westgate's communication to us this evening.
Okay, so Alderman McCarthy's motion is to amend and to replace it with the language that was presented to us this evening by Attorney Westgate. Discussion, Alderman Lopez?
So this was favorably recommended by the city planning board, but I don't think they saw Attorney Westgate's amendment. If we replace it, should we let them look at it again?
Alderman Bolton?
They did see it and they were
Yes.
fine with either version.
Yes, I was just going to say, I checked the minutes and they did see it. It was presented to them. Any other comments, questions, discussion? Alderman Clemmons?
Yeah, my question would be to the maker of the motion, Alderman McCarthy. Can you give me because I'm trying to picture this in my mind, visual person. So can you give me an example of what this would prevent that is there now?
Sure. We have a lot that's in between. You have a row of houses here and a row of houses here and a lot in the middle that actually fronts on a separate street.
Okay.
So someone comes in with a proposal to put two fairly large buildings of elderly housing that, for example, that back up to a set of existing single-family homes. The side yard setback is 10 feet. The rear yard setback is 25 feet. So you have a bunch of single-family homes that are 25 feet from the property line and expecting to be 25 feet on the other side of the fence. And now this fairly large building comes in that is now 10 feet from the property line. And I think that is the case where we have heard about it, whenever we have heard about it.
Okay.
Other questions, comments? Seeing none. Alderman Clemmons?
I guess I just now does this only affect this doesn't only affect residential property. This affects all. Are we trying? I guess my question is the intent of this to prevent stuff like that happening in residential properties? And do we not, does it really matter if it's a property that's surrounded by commercial or other things like that? I'm wondering if the intent is to prevent situations like that in residential areas, would it make sense to apply this only to residential areas?
Alderman McCarthy?
I think the answer to that is yes. I don't think in setbacks from commercial properties, rear yards. I mean, most commercial properties are pretty much up against the rear setback, if at all possible, and they are fairly small in the commercial zone. So I would contend that, yeah, the basic intent is to protect the rear yards of residential properties.
And
Alderman
my
Clemmons, please.
further question is, how would this affect projects like, like a mixed-use development such as what we are trying to get done on School Street?
It wouldn't, because all of the setbacks are effectively zero in the deed zone.
Okay.
Other questions, comments? So the motion from Alderman McCarthy is again to amend with the language from Attorney Westgate. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
And that motion carries. Alderman McCarthy?
Yeah, if we're gonna continue with it, I would, and if we want to just kill this, I'm pretty much fine with that as well. But if we want to try to address the issue, there's two things I think we ought to do. One is to change the amended wording, and I think I know how to do that, but we may want to hold on to it and look at both things. The other one is to make it apply only when the adjacent property is residential. So I'd be more than willing to leave that in the hands of our attorney and put this back on the table for a while if we want to do that.
Alderman Lopez?
I guess I'm missing the point of making it just residential. I mean, if you had a row of houses, for example, that were all residential facing in one direction, and then you had a longer piece of property with a frontage on a street, and you put a bunch of businesses behind those, wouldn't you be able to put those businesses directly behind somebody's yard? And I mean, some of those businesses could be.
No, because that's the case where it would cover it, because the adjacent property that it abuts is residential. What it basically says is if you, and in that particular case, if they're abutting street to street and rear yard to rear yard, there will already be the rear yard setback requirement. It's if you have a residential property and somebody proposes putting something in on an infill lot on the side street, then their side yard requirement might become the rear yard requirement of the residential properties.
So just because, for example, a property might have been long and thin shaped and has frontage on Amherst Street, they can't use that as the frontage I don't understand that part.
Bear in mind, this only applies to properties with multiple structures on them. If I put up a single building, then none of this applies.
Alderman Moriarty?
I still kind of like it because it gives guidance to defer, in one sense, to give precedence to pre-existing residential homes, people who have houses that are used to having yards and people with yards, so that it doesn't alter what they're used to, so that people can come in and conform. I kind of like it. I'm all for it.
Alderman Clements and Alderman Dowd.
And again, I would support that, if it was limited to just anything that would basically be adjacent to a residential area. Because to be honest with you, I agree with some of the comments that were made this evening, which was we don't want to do things that are going to prevent economic development and businesses from coming into the city. When you confuse things or make it harder to do business, that is something to consider. So, but protecting existing residential neighborhoods, I think, is important. And that if we were to amend this somehow, I might be in favor of that.
Alderman Dowd?
Yeah, I would suggest either doing the amendment and passing something tonight and getting it onto the full board, or killing it, because with this legislation pending, it's holding up developers from moving forward because they can't until they know the ramifications of this ordinance. So my suggestion to the committee would be either kill it and have it go back and get developed in a way that makes more sense, or amend it so it's not referring to commercial, and move it forward, but not table it again.
Alderman Clements?
Through you to Attorney Bolton, would it be okay under our rules, if we were to kill this legislation, could legislation that was very similar but restricted to residential be introduced?
I think that presents an issue. I can't say you can't do it, and if enough of you wanted to do it, you could always suspend your rules. I think it might be easier and resolve things more quickly if someone would make a motion to say that it only would apply when the abutting property has an existing residential use, and then leave that to the legal department to fancy it up a little bit if necessary, and we'll have it ready for the next meeting of the full board.
Alderman Clemmons?
I would make a motion to further amend to apply this only to properties that abut existing residential properties. And I would respectfully ask the city attorney's office to button up that language so that it applies correctly in here by the next full Board of Aldermen meeting.
Okay. Alderman McCarthy?
Yeah, I don't actually think that's quite enough. If you make it just abuts a residential property, then it still applies to another border between that property and a commercial one. What we basically want to do is make the setback requirement only in the segments of the boundary that are adjacent to residential properties.
Okay.
And I think we ought to make it at the discretion of the planning board.
So will you accept that change to your?
Well, I'll withdraw my motion, but because I'm not sure what the last portion of that would do. So I withdraw my motion, and I will yield to Alderman McCarthy.
Alderman McCarthy?
Well, so the intent is to allow the discretion of the planning board to be used in figuring out whether the additional setback is necessary, and to allow them to pick something that's in between. If the side yard setback is 10 feet and the backyard setback is 25, they may decide that 15 was fine.
Okay.
But thinking out loud about it, the problem is that gives you a design requirement that you can't be sure of until you get in front of the planning board, which is not generally a good thing to do. So,
If the goal is to make it simpler, you're going in the wrong direction.
yeah, with that in mind, I'm actually going to move to recommend indefinite postponement.
Okay. So the motion is to recommend indefinite postponement. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
That motion carries. Okay. So, any, general discussion? Public comment? And remarks by the alderman? There's no need for a non-public. Do I have a motion? Alderman Moriarty?
I move to adjourn.
Okay, we have a motion to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, and we are adjourned at 8:22.
What are you gonna do?
Okay, so you have everything you need for Sue to go with the minutes. 'Cause you-